The modern Great Depression is here, and it's only going to get worse. Of course, it's not going to impact everybody, but the people that are impacting are people like you and me. It's people who are working class, people who are middle class, the working poor. The vast majority of Americans are actually already in a Great Depression, but you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know it because it's not been validated. You wouldn't know it because the talking heads in media, the pundits, the politicians, our corporate overlords, our technocratic leaders, they're living just fine. None of the things that have been happening over the past couple decades, but especially now, are actually impacting them. But they're impacting us. And I know that you know exactly what I'm talking about. They may not officially come out and say that this is a depression that we're in an economic contraction. No, they won't say that. But all the similarities are there between then and now. Not on the macro, but on the micro, because the lives that we live are the micro. Let's talk about the disproportionate impact of inflation and stagnant wages. This isn't something that's felt by the upper class. This isn't something that's felt by our politicians and our leaders, but this is something that's impacting us. The cost of necessities, the cost of living has been rising so much that it's outpaced the wages of pretty much all Americans, except for a select few. Things are becoming harder and harder. It's more difficult, almost impossible, to start a family now. It's almost impossible to actually gain any kind of security in your life when everyone's so focused on the next paycheck. Because the paycheck that we have now and the paycheck that we're gonna have tomorrow, it's really only enough to actually pay off our bills, to make sure that we still have a roof over our head. It is a constant battle just to maintain any kind of financial security in your life. But for most people in America, still that security isn't there. What we're seeing right now is all-time highs in consumer debt. And of course, this is something that was echoed in the Great Depression as well. But instead, on debt taken on to invest in speculation, it's people using their credit cards to put food on the table. It's people using their credit cards to pay their bills. It's people using their credit cards to maintain their lives, their families, themselves. But not everyone can actually maintain it. And that leads us to number two, which is a scarcity in housing. It's almost impossible to actually go ahead and get a house now for the average American. In fact, most would say that it is impossible for the average American because the median household income in America is only, $80,000. But it actually go out and get a mortgage on a house takes a minimum of $120,000. If you have a family, probably more. So it's just not there. So most people are actually put in the position where they can only rent. But the fact is, rent has also raised so much that it equates to a mortgage payment, but those people can't actually get a mortgage, so they're not actually gonna have any kind of equity in their lives, even though they're paying the exact same price as it would for them to have a mortgage. It's a ludicrous situation. It's a lose-lose situation for most Americans. And it's not just Americans. This is happening all over the world, but because I'm in America, we're talking about America. And instead of actually addressing these problems, instead of actually building affordable housing that can actually get people in the position where they can have some kind of security in their lives, where they can actually produce families, which would be an economic boon for America, instead we manipulate the economy to inflate asset prices, which just make the wealthy even more wealthy. While at the same time, people like you, people like me, people like your parents, your friends and family will never be able to actually have a home. And if they have a home now, because of taxes and insurance constantly going up, there's always the fear of, will I actually be able to afford my mortgage, or is the bank going to foreclose on it? Am I gonna lose that? Is the bank gonna go ahead and sell off my house for the $2,000 that I owe and keep the $200,000, $300,000 that they made off the sale? Because we've created a system where the lenders and banks are allowed to use predatory actions to reap all the resources from the American people. And that's not even to mention student loans, which are probably the most predatory loans in existence, which anchor American citizens, young Americans with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of student debt that they really have no chance of paying off, especially when the job market, if you have a college degree and you go ahead and get a job in your field, if that happens, usually ends up paying what? $35,000, $40,000 not even a living wage. You have to come from wealth. You have to come from privilege in order to be able to take a job that pays $35,000, $40,000 just so you can chase your dream. Chasing your dream is a privilege in America, and it's not a privilege that most Americans actually have. Because the fact is, the systemic barriers that we now have in place in America, in the increasing cost of living, and the wealth disparity that's constantly growing, and in this time where we're seeing a transfer of wealth like we've never seen in history, really since the Gilded Age, social and economic mobility just isn't a thing anymore. A generational transfer of wealth for people who are in the middle class, working class, and the working poor is just not something that can even be in our minds at this point, because most people are so worried about living paycheck to paycheck. They're so worried about just survival and maintaining that they actually can't move forward and plan ahead. We are stuck in the moment. We are stuck in this depression. And the longer that this depression, this new modern Great Depression that we're in, is allowed to take hold of the American psyche, to actually entrench itself in generational philosophy of middle class Americans, the harder it will be for us to break out of it. Because a country like ours only grew great and became a first world country because the people had the freedom to plan ahead, to plan accordingly, and to develop themselves. But when you are stuck in survival, when you are stuck in the moment, you cannot develop. You enter a phase of arrested development, and that arrested development is going to become generationally transferred. Because there's no change in sight, there's no change being made, there's no plans to actually address these changes. In fact, it's only the opposite. As they cut away the social benefits, the social safety nets in America, those who are barely hanging on to any kind of security in this country are finding themselves in the most vulnerable position. And honestly, that brings us to the next point. The boom in homelessness in our country, as people cannot afford a living, as people can't afford to provide for their families, as people can't afford to maintain their familial bonds, which is one of the reasons we're seeing so many divorces, one of the reasons we're seeing so many families break apart, and the ever escalating cost of housing as well. People are just finding themselves in the street. The amount of desperation that is coming from this depression is leveling the American morale, and hundreds of millions of people in this country are finding themselves one step away from falling off of the economic cliff and being on the street. And as dangerous as it has been in the past to live on the street, even more so now as we've moved to actually criminalize the homeless, making it illegal to sleep outside, making it illegal to sleep in a tent, making it illegal to live in your car or live in your van or live in your RV, even though it's not a choice. We are being penalized and punished and kept in this depression because they need to keep us in this depression. Because the unjust nature of the system that we are now in is so evident that if people actually had the time to address it and hold those who've been perpetuating this system accountable for the grave damage that it's done to hundreds of millions of Americans, the most powerful and wealthy people in this country would find themselves on the chopping block. And I don't mean that metaphorically. We are one step away from a massive revolution in this country. And I think it's only through the hubris of the upper class and the elites in our country that they think that they are safe. Because things are going to get worse, and this depression is going to spread, and it's going to become entrenched because there's been nothing done to actually turn things around and help the American people out. There's consequences to that, right? The people can only be stretched so far before they snap. And when they snap, that's going to be hitting a lot of people's doorsteps who thought that they'd be safe inside their gated communities. It's an inevitability when you have a vast majority of people who you've essentially robbed and made them destitute and impoverished, that eventually they're going to come for you. And this isn't any kind of threat. I think this is just what history shows us. And I think the veil of illusion is really starting to slip. And it doesn't help the fact that we have things like tariffs, which are essentially a 20-30% sales tax that are hitting already over-leveraged families who now have to send their kids back to school. But because of the increase in prices, Those struggling families can't even afford school supplies and can't even afford to put new clothes on their kids. It doesn't matter what they say on the news, what the macroeconomics of the situation are. It doesn't matter if they say that the stock market's rallying in its all-time highs. It doesn't matter if they say that corporations are reaping record-breaking profits year after year. What does it matter if the vast majority of people in your country are being crushed under the wheel of the economy? What does it matter when the people are languishing in a Great Depression that no one's talking about? What does it speak to the consequences if that's continued to be ignored? As we see a more militarized government, as we see a government more willing to crack down on its own people and its supporters voraciously supporting the abuses of enforcement, what does it say for the chances of our legislative bodies in this country actually turning things around and taking hold, or even slowing down the steep descent that the people are in? It's not good. It's not good, but I have faith. I have faith in people because it's people who built this country. And even though it's people's ignorance who drove us into the spot now, through our support for people who are evidently and obviously corrupt, people who don't care anything about Americans, people who truly aren't Americans, they just belong to an economic class. But we are Americans. We are the people who make up this country, and we are in a Great Depression. And as things get worse and as things escalate and as our country gets more dangerous and as life becomes harder here, eventually they're not going to be able to be quiet about it anymore, and it's going to have to be addressed. And like I said, don't give up hope in our people. And I don't think we should either, because we're in this together, one way or another. No matter what you think politically, all that stuff goes away when we're on the breadlines together. And those people in charge, no matter who they are, whether you voted for them or whether you support them now, just be clear that they would have no problem seeing you on the breadlines, just like they would have no problem seeing their political rivals in prison. It's the position that we're in right now as the American people. The modern Great Depression has begun, and it's only going to get worse. Thank you for stopping by.